And we'll get the views this morning of a key independent, Andrew Wilkie, and we'll see to what extent his own demands of the government could yet put its majority at risk. But before then, we'll see what the Sunday papers are saying around the country. And Mr Schubert, we'll start with your story. You went back and had a look at the negotiations that Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott had with the independents, and you reveal the depth of Tony Abbott's desire to be Prime Minister.
That's right. So in long conversations this week with the full 6 crossbenchers, although some of them weren't numerically important in the final sweep because it came down to just those last 3, some of them have talked about more detail than they have previously about what they recollect of their conversations. Rob Oakeshott confirms that, yes, Tony Abbott did essentially beg them for the job, saying I would do anything to do this. But the cracker of the quote, of course, is from Tony Windsor, whose memory is that I remember him saying, "Tony, I'd do anything for the job. The only thing I wouldn't do is sell my ass, but I'd have to give serious thought to it," which I think is a perler of a quote.
Well, he constantly accused Julia Gillard of selling her soul, but little did we know.
Now, of course, we should say that Tony Abbott's office deny that he said that.
And I think you might also say that Tony Windsor claimed that Bob Katter carried toilet paper in his case, so some of Tony Windsor's...
That was a terrible slide, wasn't it?
Well, Bob Katter didn't like it. I don't know whether anyone said it about you, Barry, but Bob Katter didn't like it. So.
And what else? What else was...
well, there are a number of really interesting sort of things. So the other point that Tony Windsor makes, which I thought was an interesting reflection, was he was reflecting on Julia Gillard's struggle to cut through with the Australian people, and he says one thing that he finds it really hard is to know exactly what she believes in, that once you get past education, it's difficult to see that. He's not saying it's not there, but it's difficult to know what her core personal beliefs are. And on the other side of the ledger, you have the fascinating situation with Bob Katter, who, when I asked him, did you make the right call last year, gave a fascinating example about how he believed that Tony Abbott had effectively welched on the deal that Abbott had signed up to with Katter under his 20-point plan to mandate ethanol in petrol. As Katter tells it, Abbott's office drafted legislation to do that. They delayed and they delayed and they delayed, and then they missed the window before the Greens took control of the Senate, and he considers this a personal betrayal. So he says that he thinks Julia Gillard has failed as Prime Minister, but he's not happy with Tony Abbott.
So, Georgia, the bottom line here, I suppose, is that the key independents are not, at this point anyway, losing the faith.
I don't think they're for turning. In fact, what they've seen in the last year has probably reaffirmed their judgment. Tony Windsor told me a couple of months back when we were preparing the first anniversary of the coup that Tony Abbott went through 3 phases. The first week of the negotiations, he didn't think he'd get the job. The second week, he started to think, well, maybe I'm a chance, and then the third week he worried that he wouldn't get it. And it's quite consistent with what we've heard from Misha, that towards the end, Tony Abbott pretty much threw himself at the knees at the independents, and I think that they probably took a step back and thought, maybe this guy's probably not our guy.
But they were never going to do it. Tony Windsor compared the National Party with having cancer. From the time he got elected, Rob Oakeshott said that you couldn't have a Prime Minister. From the time Tony Abbott got elected, Rob Oakeshott said you couldn't have a Prime Minister who was a conservative Catholic. That used to be called sectarianism when I was young. So right from well before these, Windsor and Oakeshott were never going to support Abbott.
But George's point is, at one point, Tony Abbott believed that they might.
Well, he may have believed
he did.
but they were never going to do it.
And have a look at what he had to say on his blog this week. He said he described the election that no one really won, and then this interesting quote here: "She's the PM who has been selected, not elected."
But if Tony Abbott had gone through that process, then he would have been perfectly fine with it, is the other point to make on that.
OK, well now, George, the Craig Thomson affair, and there's one suggestion this morning that there are some within the coalition who want to show a bit of compassion towards Craig Thomson.
Whether they're squeamish or not on a political front, I don't think they are, but there's an interesting quote of some coalition members from the Christian right that they don't really want to tear Craig Thomson from limb to limb. Certainly go for him politically, but show a bit of empathy for the individual as a human being. And on the Labor side, there's a suggestion that there's a buddy system in place for the member for Dobell, just in case he wants a chat. And MPs have been lined up to look out for him.
Well, that's certainly true. But this idea, Jared, that some of them might have, that they've got to show a bit of empathy for him, though, it just contradicts the strategy, which has to be make the bloke crack.
Well, that may be the strategy. Look, if these anonymous members of the Christian right are accurately reported, I think that's a fine sentiment. And agree with that. But, I mean, this is a new sentiment. When the AWB scandal was on in the final years of the Howard government, members of the Labor Party and others went for the senior ministers, John Howard and Alexander Downer, and people like Andrew Limburg and the AWB organisation with a ferocity. No one then was setting up buddies or talking about Christian concern. I'm all in favour of Christian concern, but it shouldn't just be for this case. I mean, there are many cases, and Labor, going back to the Hawke days, used to go for people with a great ferocity, and no one's then said, you know, how about calling in the Salvation Army to do some counselling?
You're not suggesting there might be some hypocrisy in politics,
well, a
are you,
little
Jared?
bit, yes. But I do think you
is.
can go too hard, and these days people do worry about the consequences of this, and I don't really know that the Liberal Party needs to go any harder. I think the matter speaks for itself. I don't think you need to pursue this.
I think there's probably a point in the cycle of this story where they could have just left it to the media, because the media have smelt a big story here, and of course we get this tornado that passes through every particular issue. It blocked out everything this week, including collapse of Gaddafi's regime in Libya. I mean, it was the first thing people were talking about in the newsroom. Did they get him? Not Gaddafi, Craig Thompson. But
and the interesting thing on that point is that in my conversation with Tony Crook this week, the WA Nationals, he was happy to support the opposition motions this week in Parliament, but he says, look, I think they've done enough on it. So he's signalled, you know, that he's kind of ready to start talking about other things now.
Yeah, well, with Parliament not sitting, of course, if the media doesn't drive it in the next couple of weeks, nobody will. But the media have been going to brothels, and they're going to hotels, and they're asking questions and trying to trace. Yeah. So they're in effect running a kind of parallel investigation with the police, aren't they?
Yes.
I would expect it'll still be in the media over the next week or two.
It'll certainly be there. But I mean, I guess the thing, and I'm trying not to read between the lines here on some of these background quotes, but the concern the Coalition must have, and it was a concern that Tony Abbott expressed straight up, which is that they didn't want to go too hard just in case there was an arms race and that the Labor Party decided to throw some mud back. And something changed in the last week that Abbott, who was initially quite reticent about how hard they would pursue this thing, everybody went over the top this week. Now, on the Labor side, I'm not sure that Labor has a survival instinct, but we did see very early on in the Howard government, when they're dropping ministers and parliamentary secretaries, you know, pretty much every day they turned up to work. There then came a pushback. It was quite an unfortunate circumstance. You never want to see a repeat of it, but there was certainly a pushback when they targeted Nick Sherry as a bit of a tit for tat, and that didn't end well. So at some point, somebody might have to think, has this thing gone far enough, and maybe call it a win and move on to another issue.
Now, Jared, another former immigration official has spoken out against the treatment of asylum seekers in the detention centres.
Yeah, Claire Harvey has a story in today's Sunday Telegraph of Peter Mitchell's book, which is available in bookshops. I saw it yesterday, Compassionate Bastard, and he was head of Villawood between 1996 and 2001. And he's essentially saying, look, the system's too tough. I think that's probably right. Bear in mind, mandatory detention was set up by the Keating Labor government. John Howard inherited it, he probably toughened it, and then he softened it. But Peter Mitchell saying that, you know, it's too tough. On the other hand, it's not very clear what any government's going to do in this kind of circumstance. But people do stay in there for a long time, and decisions aren't made readily, and I can understand where he's coming from. He left at the end of 2001. But the other point to bear in mind is that however many of us are uneasy about mandatory detention, but essentially it worked, and now when the policy was softened, the boats started coming again. It's a very difficult problem. I'm sympathetic to Labor, and I'm sympathetic to the Coalition on how to handle this.
And when I said another former official, of course, there's a present-day official, Andrew Metcalfe, is weighed in on it as well.
He'd like to have a debate.
Well, Andrew Metcalfe has been a very good head of immigration. He's a very fair man, and he's bipartisan, and immigration is not happy with this, but on the other hand, there's such a demand for the politicians to do it. I mean, the great demand for mandatory detention right now is coming from people in Labor-held seats or Labor-held marginal seats. That's where the drive's coming from, and you know, there's no drive in some of the safe Liberal seats for this.
Well, that's the Sunday Papers, and we'll go straight now to our program guest, the Tasmanian Independent in the Federal Parliament, Andrew Wilkie, and he joins us from Hobart.